The second day was when the unease really set in. I'd spent my first night in the security booth, and already I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way the inmates moved, if they moved at all, was unsettling. It wasn't just the silence, it was how unnatural everything felt. Some inmates sat completely still in their cells, staring blankly at the walls. Others paced back and forth, but even their movements seemed off, as if they were trapped in some sort of rhythm that had nothing to do with reality. I walked past their cells during my rounds, trying to keep my distance. I'd been warned not to interact with them too much, but it was hard not to notice the odd behavior. Some of them barely acknowledged me, while others seemed to stare right through me, their eyes vacant and cold. Then there were the ones who seemed to know more than they should. I couldn't explain it, but the way they watched me made me feel like they were studying me, like they knew something I didn't. Their gazes weren't full of anger or fear, but rather a kind of intense, almost knowing calmness. I found myself unnerved by it. I was the one in control, but something about the way they looked at me made me feel powerless. One inmate in particular caught my attention. His name was Harris, and he had been in prison for years. His cell was close to the security booth, and I often found him staring at me through the bars. The first time I passed by his cell, he didn't move. His eyes followed me, but his face remained blank. It was only when I turned around to leave that he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, unsure of how to respond. I had been told that inmates might try to provoke me, but this didn't feel like an ordinary threat. It felt like a warning. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "They're watching," Harris said, his eyes widening. "They're always watching. You think you're safe? You're just like the rest of us. They'll come for you too." I didn't know how to respond to that. I'd heard plenty of horror stories from guards who had worked in isolated prisons like this, but this was different. I could see the fear in his eyes, but it wasn't just fear of being locked away. It was a deeper kind of fear, like he had seen something he couldn't explain. Before I could ask anything else, Harris fell silent again, returning to his unnerving stillness. I moved on quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The warning from one of the inmates felt more than just a threat. It felt like a prophecy. As the day dragged on, the other inmates seemed to grow more restless. The ones who had been eerily quiet began muttering to themselves, their voices low and intelligible. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, almost as if they were trying to keep something secret from me. The most disturbing part, though, was when I heard a faint scratching noise coming from one of the cells. I couldn't tell which one at first, but it sounded like fingernails scraping against the walls. I turned toward the sound, but by the time I reached the corridor where it had come from, there was nothing. The cell was empty, and the noise had stopped. I thought maybe it was just my imagination or the usual creaks and groans of the prison settling, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I continued my rounds, trying to push the unease aside, but as I walked past the cells, the strange behavior of the prisoners seemed to intensify. One of them, a man named Jacobs, leaned against the bars of his cell, his eyes fixated on me. He didn't blink, didn't move, he just stared. It was like he was waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from his gaze. It felt too intense, too unsettling. "You're not supposed to be here either," Jacob said, his voice cold and emotionless. I swallowed hard. I was starting to feel trapped,
like the walls of the prison were closing in on me. Every time I passed one of the cells, it felt like the prisoners were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The worst part was that I couldn't tell who was the most dangerous. Was it the ones who stared at me like they knew something I didn't? Or was it the ones who were completely silent, as though they had lost their grip on reality? Then something happened I didn't expect. As I walked past cell 13, I couldn't help but glance toward the darkened corner of the corridor. I had been told never to look at it for too long, but my curiosity got the best of me. And that's when I saw it. There was a faint glow coming from under the door, just like the night before. This time I couldn't dismiss it as a trick of the light. The glow seemed to pulse, growing brighter with each passing second. It wasn't just a light. It felt like something was alive behind that door. I quickly turned away, my heart racing, but as I walked down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had noticed me. Something had been waiting for me to look. I kept walking, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at my gut, but I knew, deep down, that I had crossed a line. I had broken one of the rules. And I was starting to realize that some rules weren't just meant to be followed. They were meant to keep me alive.
The first night shift came quickly, and I wasn't ready for it. I had been told that the nights were quiet, a time for reflection and routine, but it didn't feel that way. There was something about the dark that changed everything. The prison felt different after sunset, like it became its own twisted entity, alive and watching. As soon as the day shift left, I found myself alone in the security booth. The walls outside seemed to close in as the lights flickered above. The only sound was the occasional rustling of paper, the creaking of the old structure, and the distant sound of metal shifting from somewhere deep in the bowels of the prison. I shivered, trying to push the unease aside. It was just my imagination, I told myself. Just another night in a prison. Nothing strange, nothing out of the ordinary. But it didn't take long before I realized I was wrong. I checked the monitors again. The prison was still, too still. The lights in the hallways flickered, casting strange, long shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. My eyes kept darting back to cell 13, where the faint glow from earlier had not disappeared. It pulsed, faintly, like a heartbeat. My pulse quickened as I watched, knowing full well I was breaking the rule I had been warned about. But something was drawing me to it, something I couldn't explain. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move in the shadows. I whipped my head toward the monitor, scanning the feed. The figure disappeared before I could make sense of it. There was nothing on the screen, just a cold, empty hallway. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I knew I shouldn't have been staring at cell 13 for that long. I shifted my focus back to the rest of the prison, checking each of the cell blocks, making sure everything was in order. But that feeling, like something was watching me, didn't go away. It lingered, hanging over me like a dark cloud. The minutes stretched on. Then, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat. It came from the west wing, the section where the most dangerous inmates were held. I quickly pulled up the monitor for that area, scanning it carefully. For a moment, nothing. Just the same empty halls, bathed in the dim yellow light from the ceiling. But then I saw movement. A prisoner was standing near the door, his face pressed against the glass. I recognized him instantly. It was Jacobs, the man who had stared at me earlier that day. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted in terror. He tapped on the glass with his fingers, slowly at first, then faster, as if trying to get my attention. "Help me," he mouthed. I froze, not sure what to do. The rules told me not to interact with the inmates unless it was necessary, but I couldn't ignore this. Something about the way he looked at me, his eyes wide with panic, made me feel like he was truly in danger. I reached for the intercom, hesitated, and then spoke.
"What's going on, Jacobs?" I asked, my voice crackling through the speaker. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, his hands now clawing at the glass, trying to get closer. "They're coming for me," he whispered, but the sound was muffled through the intercom. I leaned closer to the speaker, my heart racing. "Who's coming for you?" His eyes widened even further, and then he shook his head frantically. "You don't get it," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're not safe here. None of us are. They're watching, waiting. The rules, they keep us all trapped. But it's too late for me. It's too late for all of us." The air in the security booth grew cold. I felt a chill run down my spine and a sense of dread wash over me. What was Jacobs trying to tell me? What was he so afraid of? Suddenly, I heard a loud scraping sound from behind me, like something dragging across the floor. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the flickering lights and the silence of the prison. I quickly turned back to the monitor, only to find Jacobs had disappeared from the glass. His cell was empty now, the door standing open. I blinked, confused. Hadn't he just been there? I checked the rest of the hallways. Nothing. The prison was completely still. But then something caught my eye on the monitor. There was movement in the dark corners of the hall. It was just a shadow at first, but then it took shape. Long and thin, like a figure standing just out of reach of the light. I squinted, my heart racing as I tried to make out the details, but it was too far. All I could see was the faint outline of a person, or something like a person. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. My mind raced back to everything I had been warned about. The rules. Cell 13. Don't break the rules. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wasn't just a strange coincidence. It was connected to the rules that had been put in place to protect us. But from what? The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second stretching out longer than the last. I found myself staring at the monitor, unable to move, unable to look away. My fingers hovered over the intercom button, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The figure moved again, closer this time. I was trapped. And then it spoke. "I see you." The voice came from the monitor, but it wasn't Jacob's. It was deeper, raspier, a low, distorted voice that made my blood run cold. I shot up from my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure on the screen was now standing directly in front of the camera, but it wasn't human. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The monitor flickered, and then everything went black. I sat in the dark, frozen, my mind racing. The lights flickered above me. The only sound was the distant hum of the prison. I felt a presence all around me, pressing in from every direction. I remembered the warning Rick had given me. The rules are there for a reason. But now I realized that the reason wasn't just to keep the inmates in line. The rules were there to keep something else in check. Something that was now hunting me.